So I titled this shiur, the parts of the Haggadah that are difficult to understand. And I think that's it's a relevant topic because there's something that I've observed over the years that it kind of hurts me every time I see it. And it's when you have the reading of the Haggadah shared across the room, and it comes to someone's turn, and they're asked to read the next line, and they read the following thing. And with an outstretched forearm, this refers to the sword, as it is stated, 1 Chronicles 21:16, and his sword was drawn in his hand, leaning over Jerusalem. Next person. And it's like, what was just said? What does it have anything to do with the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? What is the outstretched forearm? What is the sword? And what are we reading when we say that? And no one has a clue. And then the next person reads, and with great awe, this refers to the revelation of the divine presence, as it is stated, or did God try to take for himself a nation from within a nation with enigmas, etc.? Okay, I don't think reading the Hebrew and the English, or having one person trade between the Hebrew and the English, actually resolves the problem. I actually think it complicates it. Because then you say, Ubemora hagadol, zu gilui shechina, shene'emar o hanisa Elohim lavo lakachal. Those are all really difficult Hebrew words for anyone who reads Hebrew. And most people who are helping us through the recital of Magid at the Seder, they don't flow like that. So it's O Hanisa Elohim Lakachat. And what happens in the process of all of this is that everything gets lost. And maybe you have some wise guy at the Seder who's like interjecting, but like by the time you've got to the paragraph that I'm reading, right? The Yad HaChazokan, the Zeroah HaNetuya, people are impatient. We're already more than halfway through the Magid. We're all a little bit lost. And it's really quite difficult to understand. So what I'd like to do is just select a few difficult parts of this section of the Magid. And I'm ignoring the 5 rabbis who sat in Bnei Berak, the 4 questions, the 4 sons, the statement about, I'm about 70 years old and never did I know that you should recite the Exodus of Egypt at night. I'm leaving all of that behind. I'm not claiming that that's less confusing. Often it is confusing. It's like, okay, when's the story going to start already? But I'm getting to this because that stuff is already expounded upon. This is more than halfway through, and it starts to get really confusing. So I'm going to just direct your attention to my screen here. I'm going to maximize the size of the Hebrew here. And this is what's called in the English translation, the first fruits declaration, right? And it's based on the Mishnah that says, as we tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Vedoresh me'arami oved avi, that we have to start our derasha, our midrash, that's what the term doresh means, from the declaration Arami Oved Avi, which in its context refers to my forefather who was a wandering Aramean. In the context of the Haggadah is a reference to Lavan, who sought to undermine or to destroy my forefather who was Yaakov. And we do that because it is a starting point on the basis of a poem which is mentioned in the Torah. Now that poem is nowhere to be found in the actual story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That poem takes place all the way at the end of the Torah in Parashat Ki Tavo, when it envisions the future in which we have an established Makom Mikdash, a place of the Mikdash, where once a year farmers are bringing their first fruits, and as they bring their first fruits, they tell a story. And that story begins at the very beginning. The very beginning is with our forefathers and our enslavement in Egypt and our redemption from Egypt and our eventual arrival to the land where God blessed us with agricultural land which bore these fruits, and I bring these fruits to the Kohen now. I'm telling that story because that story sort of tells it all. But the Haggadah is not just the telling of that story. It's a midrash that accompanies that story. And the reason why that's complicated is because midrash itself is complicated. It's not easy to just pick up midrash and read it like one would a story, any midrash. Midrash introduces pesukim from places in Tanakh that most are not familiar with, that at face value have little to do with the primary text that's being expounded upon, and it really takes a scholar to get the connection. And even a scholar usually has to look up those pesukim in their place, so that when I have, my Aunt Cindy at the table saying, and with an outstretched forearm, this refers to the sword as it states, and his sword was drawn in his hand, leaning over Jerusalem. And Cindy has no clue where that verse is from and why Jerusalem is even mentioned and what the sword is referring to and what that has anything to do with the Haggadah story. She's just reading it and passing the book on to the next person who's hungry, and everything gets lost along the way. All of that is by way of introduction. A Haggadah that I really prefer to use always is the Otzer Mefarshe HaHaggadah, a thick volume referred to as the anthology of the Haggadah. And I use it at the Seder, not for the anthology. I'm not interested in boring anyone, but because of the way it's structured when it presents the Haggadah itself. Now, the actual text is color-coded. The PDF that I have before you is in black and white, so I went ahead and color-coded it myself. And what it does is it shows us what's actually going on. So that I open up with a statement. Arami oved aviv vayered Mitzrayim. My father was a wandering Aramean who descended to Egypt, where he lived for a short period, but there he became a great, immense, I don't know how to describe a Rav, but large nation. And what each next line does is says, all right, now let's go back to that main verse of Vayagor Sham and go through each two words one by one and tell us why this poem is just teaching us the story as we know it. Vayered Mitzrayma, right here, can be found in that original text right there. So what did it mean when it said Vayered Mitzrayma and he descended to Egypt? Well, it means Anus al pi hadibur. He had no other choice. It was the decree of God. He didn't choose to go down to Egypt. God puppeteered his way down to Egypt. And we know that story. Yosef was sold. Yosef became a king or a viceroy. And then there was a famine. And the famine affected Canaan. And the people had to go down. And Yosef kidnapped Shimon. And then he forced Binyamin to come forward. All of that was Anus al pi hadibur. It was the divine mandate that could not be acted otherwise. Vayagor Sham. Well, Vayagor means he dwelled there, meaning to say his intent wasn't to stay there for a long time, and so on and so forth. Just going back to that original one sentence that we started with. So far, so good. It's not so confusing. Vayareu otanu hamitzrim vaya'anunu. They inflicted harm upon us. They inflicted suffering upon us. They gave us difficult labor. And then each word by word simply tells us what we already know from the book of Shemot. So far, so good. This isn't complicated yet. Vanitzak el Adonai Elohenu. And so we cried out to Adonai, our God, and the God of our forefathers. Vayishma Adonai et kolenu, and God heard our voices. Vayaret onenu, and he saw our suffering, and he also saw amalenu, our toil, ve'et lahatzenu, and the pressure that we were subjected to. Now I have three apparently synonymous words. Onyenu, suffering, amalenu, toil, lahatzenu, pressure. So Midrash wants to know what's the difference between each of these three words. Onyenu, our suffering, from the Hebrew word einui, zu perishut derech eretz, or zo perishut derech eretz. This is a reference to the Egyptian mandate that men and wives not sleep together, either because they actually forcefully separated men and wife, or because they subjected each of them to such intense labor that when they came home at night, there was just nothing that they could do. How do we know that this took place? Torah doesn't actually tell us that it took place per se. That's where Midrash comes in with this pasuk of Vayar Elohim et Bnei Israel. God saw the people of Israel, Vayeda Elohim, and God knew. What did he see? So again, Aunt Cindy is going to read that at the time. And again, this is not an attack on women. Most men who read this don't know either. Right? She'll say, and God saw the people of Israel and God knew. Next. I have no idea what that's a reference to. I don't know how those words prove that this is the separation of man and wife. Besides for the fact that most English translations are not straightforward about what perishut derech eretz means. They say it's a separation of the way of life. Do you know what that means at face value? I'm looking for it in the English. And he saw our affliction. This refers to the separation from the way of the world. That could mean anything. What it means is it's a separation of man and wife from sexual relations. And how do I know it from the verse, and God saw and God knew? Two ways. First of all, it just says that God saw. Why doesn't it tell us what God saw? Because whatever it is that God saw was private. And what do we normally assume to be private, not to be spoken about publicly? You know what? That's how we know that that's a reference to separation of man and wife. The second way we know that is Vayeda Elohim, and God knew. And as I'm sure all of you know, the English expression, to know in a biblical sense. And Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and she bore a child. Anytime we see the term Vayeda, and he knew, in the context of a relationship, it means a sexual encounter, and it's usually followed by conception and pregnancy. Vayeda blank vatahar vateled, and he knew his wife so-and-so, and she conceived and she gave birth. To know in a biblical sense. So that's how we know that onyenu, our suffering, well, what suffering could it possibly refer to? We know he saw, vayar, and when we look at the actual text of the Exodus of Egypt, we see somewhere that God saw, and since it doesn't say what God saw, we can infer that he saw something private. This is what he saw. Ve'et amalenu, and our toil. Amal means toil, like work. Now, simply speaking, that could be a reference to like the enslavement, the hard work. Elu habanim. However, it tells us that this is actually a reference to the male children who were killed. Now, how does Torah know that? And it actually doesn't draw an exact connection. This is a midrashic inference. Whereas above we had the connection vayar and vayar. He saw, he saw. What did he see? Well, let's look back at the original story and see God seeing. see that there's nothing there and infer that it's a reference, therefore, to that which is private. But when it comes to the children, it's an inference. We think of the term amal, toil, well, it takes toil to raise children. It's not easy to raise a child. It's not easy to bring a child to term and pregnancy. It's not easy to bring a child into adulthood and that they be a good person. So for the Egyptians to then take that and just throw it in the Nile, it's our wasted labor, our wasted work. But that the Midrash is inferring on its own. Ve'et lachatzenu, and our duress. Again, how would Uncle Saul read this at the Seder? And our duress, this refers to the pressure, as it is stated, and they also saw the duress that the Egyptians are applying on them. And then he passes on the text to the next person. We have no idea what the duress is talking about. Well, we know that the term lahatz in the context of the story itself was imposed upon the people by Egypt. Halahatz asher Mitzrayim lohatzim otam. So here the Hebrew reader at the Seder could make better sense of what's taking place here. The English reader is still getting a bit lost, but I know that it's something that they're applying upon me. And I can infer from the verse that that's pressure, meaning to say you are giving me too much to do in too little time and putting too much at stake, and I'm caving in. I'm not able to sustain it all. That's lahatzenu, and I can infer that from the verse. So far, so good. Let's go back. If my screen is still being shared, I have a big verse. So again, here, Dad is reading, and we cried out to Adonai, the God of our fathers, and Adonai heard our voices, and he saw our suffering, our toil, and our pressure. He then passes the Haggadah on to the next person who says, and we cried out to Adonai, the God of our fathers, as it says, and it came to be during those days. Now, visually, you see how that's structured. We started with the whole pasuk, and now we're going to go back clause by clause to understand what each clause was a reference to based on the text that we know and other supportive texts, and if we have no supportive text, based on the Midrash's own inference. And that is how Midrash is generally structured. Now, here's a question, and if you guys want to unmute your microphones here and give me an answer. When the Mishnah told us that we are doresh from Arami Oved Avi, when the Mishnah says that, does the Mishnah have a specific text in mind? Is the Mishnah referring to this Midrash? Anyone? So the answer is we don't really know. It's very possible that in the time of the Mishnah, they passed around the Chumash itself that had these Pesukim, and each one said, what do you think it means, Yad Chazakah, the strong arm, the strong hand, rather? And someone else at the table, well, strong hand, let's look through the book of Shemot and see if that's in there. And what do you think it means when he says outstretched arm? Maybe they didn't know, or maybe each member of the family proposed something different. It was a fluid conversation. Eventually, the Haggadah incorporated this Midrash. And while to someone who's learned in Midrash, the structure of the Midrash makes sense, to others it's very possible that they may have gotten lost along the way a long time ago. And so having a text like the one I have here on my screen laid out in this color-coded and then poetically structured text can actually be really helpful for everyone at the table. And so you have the next major pasuk that's being expounded upon, and God, Vayotzienu Adonai miMitzrayim, beyad hazaka ubizroa netuya uvemora gadol uveotot uvemofetim. And he took us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm and a great awe and signs and wonders. Now, I urge you to operationally define a strong hand, an outstretched arm, a great awe, a sign, and a wonder. That's a really hard thing to have to explain. We don't know what each of those means in operational terms. That's a very difficult thing to explain. And so you have the first clause, which is the declaration of not an angel, not a seraph, not a messenger, and then secretly not Moshe, rather it was God, he, himself, the Almighty. And it quotes a pasuk that says, I, God, will pass through Egypt on that night, and I, God, will smite all firstborns in Egypt. That's the Haggadah's manifesto of not to assume that it was someone else. That's pretty straightforward. I think everyone at the Seder follows that one. But then it says, Beyad Hazakah, the strong hand. This refers to the pestilence. Zo hadever. The pestilence. We don't know what pestilence is. In fact, it's hard to know what pestilence is even in context. How do we know that it's Yad HaChazakah, a strong hand, is a reference to the pestilence, which I'm now, by the way, not going to refer to as pestilence, but I'm going to refer to as plague or epidemic in more relevant terms. Because it says, Hine Yad Adonai Hoya. If you look back at the 10 plagues, it referred to the hand of God. Now, it's not the only makah that refers to the hand of God. The expression of the hand of God is used throughout the 10 plagues, most prominently in the final of them, the plague of the firstborns. So why specifically are we choosing Dever, the epidemic, to describe the hand of God? We don't have a clear answer to that. But it's very easy for everyone reading along at the Seder to stop following here, to lose sense of what's being described. Beyad Chazakah, with a strong hand, is a reference to the hand of God that afflicted your livestock in the field, your horses, your donkeys, your camels, and all of your livestock. It will be a heavy plague. We infer in the Haggadah that the hand referred to in Devarim is a reference to this plague in particular because the term hand was used. Midrash is probably also operating on other rabbinic statements that say Dever, the invisible plague, was the most shocking. And we often think of the darkness as the invisible plague, but this one is even worse than that. And first of all, because it plays out a few times, right? So the death of the firstborns is also referred to as a magefa, as a lingof, nogef. And dever and magefa are synonymous terms. It's the invisible killer. It's the virus that creeps out there and that infects people that they can't trace it back to something that they touched or something they were exposed to. And they're supposed to stay indoors because to go outdoors is dangerous because it's out there, lurking. Tanakh is no stranger to epidemics and describes it in many places in these exact terms. That's Dever. And it's scary. It's scary because it's invisible. You could see a frog coming your way, down your throat, into your ovens. You could see your water turning to blood, but you can't see that virus as it enters your body and then quickly kills you, or your livestock, or your animals, or your possession, or everything in front of you. It's invisible. They're there, they're healthy, and then they're dead. That's the Yad Adonai, the hand of God. maybe it's specifically Dever because the hand of God is often invisible. God is the master puppeteer of the world, but you can't see the strings. And so when Devarim speaks of the strong hand, it's self-evident to the author of the Haggadah and to the author of this Midrash that that's a reference to the most invisible plague, the Dever. Talmud also tells us that every plague had Dever accompanying it, had what I've been referred to as plague, but the epidemic going along with it, the invisible killer that creeped into people's bodies and killed them in large numbers. So that's Dever for you. And then you have Zeroa Netuya. In English, again, this time I'm reading it, the family Seder, and with an outstretched arm. This refers to the sword, as it is stated, and his sword was drawn in his hand, leaning over Jerusalem. And then I pass the Haggadah to the next person, having no clue what I just read. The verse, the sword was drawn in his hand, leaning over Jerusalem, in Hebrew, V'charbo shelufa beyado netuya al Yerushalayim, is a scene in the Tanakh that has absolutely nothing to do with the Exodus of Egypt. Nothing at all. It's a reference to King David's time when he did a census of the people, and the census caused an epidemic to wreak havoc among the people and killed 70,000. Again, so the outsider reads this and thinks, okay, so there was a sword. I don't know what the sword is referring to. Maybe the Egyptians killed themselves with a sword. Maybe God had a sword. Maybe Moses had a sword. Who knows? The sword, in context, actually refers to the following. And I'm going to open up on my screen. So I'm just going to quickly go to the beginning of the parak. This is in Divrei Hayamim Aleph, parak Chaf Aleph. David said to Yoav and to the commander of the army, go and count Israel from Beersheba to Dan. He wanted a census of all of the people, and he wanted them to be counted directly. But we know already from Parashat Kitisa, you're not supposed to count the people directly. They're each supposed to give a half shekel, and that's how you know. Because to count them directly invites fill in the blanks, ayin hara, or whatever danger upon the people. And all of a sudden, there's a famine, and there's a plague that starts killing people en masse. And David freaks out and he says, Tzar li me'od nipela na beyad Adonai. I'm in great duress, let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his compassion is very great. Ubeyad Adam al epola, and let me not fall into the hands of man. And God sent an epidemic into Israel, and 70,000 men fell in Israel. And then it says God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was about to wreak destruction, God saw and renounced further punishment and said to the angel, enough. And David looked up and he saw the angel standing between heaven and earth with a drawn sword in his hand directed at Jerusalem. That's the verse in the Haggadah. So we said the outstretched arm, that is the sword, and it quotes this verse. What is the outstretched arm? We have a source in Tanakh where an angel of God talking to David has an outstretched arm with a sword pointing over Jerusalem, and the context is there's an epidemic that has just killed 70,000 people. So the sword is nothing but another expression of Dever. The cherev that's described here that nobody knows what it's talking about in the Haggadah, you have to look up that verse in Divrei Hayamim to know what it's talking about, and it's talking about another description of epidemic, of an invisible killer. And who's behind the invisible killer? The arm of God. specifically the arm of God that bears a sword. Elsewhere in Tanakh, a reference to the angel of death. Elsewhere in rabbinic literature, referred to as the angel of death. So the outstretched arm with the sword is a description of God in his most kind of gruesome act of mass killing. It's actually a description of an epidemic. That's what's going on here. And so you see so much attention being paid to one plague, that of Dever, the invisible killer, the epidemic. And the rabbinic literature saying that one plague was so big, it actually accompanied all of them. So shocking because it didn't have a visual. You couldn't trace it back to the water that you drank. You just went out in the street or you stayed at home and you got it and you died. And that was shocking. And that was inflicted upon Egypt. Next in the Haggadah. I don't have that much time left. Ube mora gadol. And with great mora. I said that was awe before. But mora, which does actually mean awe, awesome, awful, like nora, scary, frightening, that resh aleph can also mean to see, like ra'o, ra'iti. Resh aleph is to see. So this is the Gilui Shekhinah. In English, let me open up my Haggadah again. The revelation of the divine presence, meaning there was a visual of God. And we know that there was a visual of God because elsewhere in Sefer Devarim, Moshe says so. It specifically says, Ubemoraim gedolim, and to those great sights, Kechol asher asal lechem Adonai Elohechem b'Mitzrayim le'enecha. To all that God did for you in Egypt before your eyes. You saw God, or you saw God's hand. Morah doesn't mean you were afraid of something great, or you saw something fearful and great. It's you actually saw with your eyes something great. That being a reference to the Shekhinah, the presence of God itself. So now the Haggadah starts to actually make sense. Okay? I'm going to skip a little bit past the 10 Commandments to the final part that I think really throws people off quite a bit. And that's the 10, 50, 20, 200, 50, 250 calculation. What we refer to as Rabbi Yosef HaGelili. Rabbi Yosef HaGelili said, listen, I've got a basic calculation for you. You all believe that there were 10 plagues in Egypt. And indeed, Torah describes 10 plagues in Egypt. But let me tell you something. It was actually worse than that. There were 10 plagues in Egypt, but at sea, there were 50 plagues. How do I know? Because during the plagues in Egypt, Pharaoh's servants said, this is the finger of God. It's Etzba Elohim, the finger of God. And at sea, it says the great hand. Finger, hand, finger, hand. So if each plague is a finger, then at sea, there must have been a full hand, meaning 5 times what there was during the plagues. So if there were 10 plagues, there were 50 plagues at sea. That's Rabbi Yosef HaGelili. It could have ended there. Great, we're talking about the sea during the Haggadah because the sea was a part of the story, and it also tells us something about the 10 plagues. So it all fits, it all makes sense. We could have ended it there. But as Midrash often does, it goes into an elongated tangent that I think loses some people at the table. And it says, well, actually, the original 10, they were actually 40. You see, because there's another pasuk that says, Yeshalach bam haron apo evra vaza'am vetzara umishlachat malachei re'im. That too is not mentioned in the context of the 10 plagues. It's another pasuk in Tanakh that Midrash draws the analogy to. And it counts 4 items: Evra, Za'am, Tzara, and Mishlachat Malachei Re'im. 4 things. I'm not even going to translate them for you. So 10 times 4, 40. And if Rabbi Yosei HaGalili's original argument still stands that for each one in Egypt, there were 5 times that amount at the sea, so then my 40 just turned into 200 at sea. And then Rabbi Akiva says, no, you got it wrong. You're reading that verse wrong. It wasn't 4, it was 5. Well, if there was 5 for each one in Egypt, then there was 250 at sea. And that takes a big chunk of the end of the Magid, when everyone's confused. Like, no one knows what this has to do with the story. And it's like the English words are so difficult. His anger, wrath, fury, and trouble, a sending of messengers of evil. The fierceness of his anger, the wrath, the fury, the trouble, that brings us to 4. A sending of messengers of evil brings us to 5. You can say from here that in Egypt, I'm sure you've all lost me already. And so it does help to have this visual, and it also helps to realize that sometimes Midrash does go into tangents, and sometimes these tangents are not so tangible, and we get lost along the way. But it is a part of our Haggadah, and we must go through it as we go through the Haggadah, but certainly to get a sense of the structure is helpful. If you would like, I welcome you to send me an email at rabbim@magendavidny.org after the class, and I'm happy to send you a PDF of this structured document that I had prepared. Otherwise, that's what I had to present to you today. I hope it didn't confuse anyone. And I thank you all for joining very much. And take care. Chazakim uberuchim tihiyu.